5,000 years ago, on a large island in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, a civilization appeared that should not have been possible. It built palaces of extraordinary architectural complexity with multiple stories, elaborate drainage systems, and interior courtyards designed around principles of light and ventilation that were centuries ahead of anything nearby. It produced art, frescoes of dolphins and acrobats and flowing natural scenes that displayed a sophistication and joy in human life unlike anything else in the ancient world at that time. It developed the first writing system in European history, a script that remains undeciphered to this day, and it built a maritime trading network that reached Egypt, the Levant, the Aegean Islands, and mainland Greece, placing this island civilization at the center of a web of exchange that helped define the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The civilization was Minoan, the island was Crete, and for more than a century after the ruins of its great palace at Knossos were first excavated in 1900, scholars could not agree on where these people had come from, or how they had developed such remarkable capabilities in what appeared, from the outside, to be relative isolation. Ancient DNA has now answered that question, and the answer overturned theories that were built by some of the most respected names in the history of archaeology. The man who first brought the Minoans to the world's attention was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist who began excavating Knossos on Crete in 1900 and dedicated the next 3 decades of his life to uncovering and reconstructing what he found there. Evans was the person who named the civilization, after the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology, who was said to have ruled from Knossos and whose palace housed the mythical labyrinth. He was also the person who first posed the question of Minoan origins with the authority and urgency that launched a century of debate. Evans believed, based on stylistic similarities between certain Minoan artifacts and objects from Egypt and Libya, that the founders of Minoan civilization had migrated to Crete from North Africa. The sophistication of what he was uncovering, the palatial architecture, the elaborate fresco tradition, the evident social complexity seemed to Evans, too, advanced to have developed from local roots on a Mediterranean island without an external source of inspiration or population. Other archaeologists proposed their own migration theories over the following decades. The Minoans were said to have come from Anatolia, from what is now Western Turkey, from the Balkans, from the Levant, from somewhere in the broader Middle East. The consensus was not on where they came from, but on the idea that they had come from somewhere, that they were migrants, arrivals, transplants, who had brought civilization with them when they sailed to Crete. Like and subscribe, because the ancient DNA evidence dismantled every single one of those migration theories simultaneously, and replaced them with an origin story that is, in its own way, even more extraordinary. The pivotal genetic study was published in August 2017 in the journal Nature by a large international research team led by Iosif Lazaridis of Harvard Medical School, with key contributions from David Reich at Harvard, Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and George Stamatoyiannopoulos at the University of Washington. The team assembled genome-wide data from 19 Kenyan ancient individuals, including Minoans from Crete, Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, and their eastern neighbors from southwestern Anatolia. The Minoan samples were drawn from burial sites across Crete, dating from approximately 2900 BCE to 1700 BCE, the period of the civilization's formation and peak. These were the people who built Knossos and the other great Minoan palace complexes, who painted the frescoes, who sailed the trading routes. The genomic data extracted from their bones and teeth was compared against a reference database of nearly 3,000 ancient and modern individuals spanning the Old World. The picture that emerged was clear, detailed, and entirely inconsistent with any of the migration hypotheses that had dominated the field for more than a century. The Minoans were genetically local. Rather than coming from a distant civilization, they were descended from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean region. This is a critically important distinction. The Neolithic Anatolian ancestry in Minoan DNA is not evidence of a recent Iron Age or Bronze Age migration from Anatolia. It is ancient, tracing back to the original spread of agricultural populations from Anatolia into the Aegean region approximately 9,000 years ago, when the first farming communities colonized the Greek islands, and eventually Crete as part of the same continental-scale Neolithic expansion that brought agriculture to all of Europe. Those early Neolithic settlers arrived on Crete around 7000 BCE, roughly 4,000 years before the Minoan civilization emerged as a recognizable cultural phenomenon. At least 3/4 of Minoan ancestry came from these first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean, making them the dominant genetic foundation of the civilization. The people who built the palaces, painted the dolphins, invented the writing system, and sailed the trading routes were not recent arrivals from North Africa or the Middle East. They were the descendants of settlers who had been on Crete for 4,000 years before a single palace wall was constructed. Like and subscribe. because the remaining quarter of Minoan ancestry came from somewhere unexpected. And this is the finding that opened a completely new chapter in the story of Bronze Age population history. Most of the remainder of Minoan ancestry came from ancient populations related to those of the Caucasus and Iran. This Eastern Caucasian and Iranian-related component amounts to between 9 and 17% of Minoan ancestry, and it represents a genetic input that arrived in Crete before the Minoan civilization reached its peak. It is not the steppe ancestry that drove the Indo-European language expansions across Europe in the Bronze Age. The Minoans carry essentially none of that steppe-related component that shows up strongly in mainland European populations from the same period. The Caucasus and Iran-related component is a different signal, entirely pointing to a migration or series of migrations from the eastern Mediterranean corridor into the Aegean region during the 4th or 3rd millennium BCE. This indicates a previously unrecorded prehistoric migration event across the Mediterranean corridor, bringing new cultural and genetic layers to Crete without erasing the native population. The timing of this eastern component, when researchers attempted to bracket it, using other ancient DNA datasets from the region, appeared to correspond roughly to the period of increasing metallurgical sophistication and expanding Mediterranean trade networks in the late 4th millennium BCE, suggesting that the genetic signal might be connected to the cultural and technological developments that preceded the Minoan fluorescence. The discovery of this Caucasian and Iranian-related ancestry in Minoan DNA also carried an important implication for understanding how it got there. The researchers noted that this Eastern genetic component was shared between Minoans and Myceneans. It appeared in both civilizations, suggesting it had entered the Aegean gene pool before the divergence between the Cretan Minoan lineage and the mainland Mycenean lineage. It was previously believed that this Eastern ancestry was brought to Europe by steppe pastoralists from the north, who themselves shared this Eastern ancestry. However, the Minoans do not show genetic heritage from the northern steppe populations. This indicates that, at least in some cases, this Eastern heritage from the Caucasus and Iran arrived in Europe independently, perhaps in a previously unknown migration event. That finding, that Eastern ancestry could arrive in the Aegean via a direct Mediterranean route without the involvement of steppe pastoralists, was itself a revision of prevailing models about how population mixing worked during the Bronze Age. It opened a new research question about which specific route this Eastern component traveled and what cultural or economic circumstances drove its westward movement. The comparison between Minoans and Myceneans is where the ancient DNA reveals something especially significant about the relationship between the two most famous civilizations of the Bronze Age Aegean, and where a single, important genetic difference turns out to explain a lot about why their histories diverged in the way they did. Minoans and Myceneans were genetically very similar, yet distinct. Both derived at least 3/4 of their ancestry from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean, and both carried the Caucasus and Iran-related Eastern component. The civilizations that scholars have spent centuries comparing and contrasting, the palatial Minoan culture with its peaceful imagery and maritime orientation versus the militaristic, warrior-centered Mycenaean culture with its shaft graves and armor, were built by people who were genetically close relatives. They shared the same fundamental ancestral foundation. But there was one difference. The Myceneans differed from Minoans in deriving additional ancestry from an ultimate source related to the hunter-gatherers of Eastern Europe and Siberia, introduced via a proximal source related to either the inhabitants of the Eurasian steppe or Armenia. This steppe component, which amounts to between 4 and 16% of Mycenaean ancestry and is essentially absent in the Minoans, is the genetic signature of the Bronze Age migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe that brought Indo-European languages across the European continent. Like and subscribe, because this single genetic difference, the presence of steppe ancestry in Myceneans but not in Minoans, explains one of the most consequential facts in the entire history of Bronze Age civilization. The migration of the northern steppe pastoralists reached as far as mainland Greece but did not reach the Minoans on Crete. Crete's geography protected it. An island in the middle of the Mediterranean, separated from the Greek mainland by a stretch of sea, was not accessible to the overland migration routes through which steppe populations moved into southeastern Europe. The steppe migrations that reshaped the genetic and linguistic landscape of mainland Greece, carrying Indo-European language with them and eventually producing the Mycenaean Greek-speaking civilization, simply did not arrive on Crete in the same way or the same quantities. The Mycenaeans spoke Greek, an Indo-European language. The Minoans spoke whatever language was written in Linear A, the undeciphered writing system that predates and is distinct from the Linear B script the Mycenaeans later adapted to write Greek. T. He genetic difference between the two civilizations, steppe ancestry present in Mycenaeans, essentially absent in Minoans, maps directly onto the linguistic difference between a civilization that spoke an Indo-European language and one that apparently did not. Linear A remains one of the most tantalizing unsolved puzzles in the history of ancient writing. The script was used throughout the Minoan civilization's active period, appearing on clay tablets, stone vessels, and seals from numerous sites across Crete. It clearly represents a writing system adapted to record some specific language, and its signs share structural similarities with the later Linear B script, which the Mycenaeans adapted, and which has been deciphered as an early form of Greek. But despite decades of scholarly effort, Linear A has never been read. The language it encodes appears to be non-Indo-European, based on its phonological structure as far as researchers can infer it. The genetic evidence from the 2017 Nature study provides context for that linguistic isolation. The Minoans, unlike the Mycenaeans, were not recipients of the steppe population movement that spread Indo-European language across mainland Greece. Whatever language the Minoans spoke descended from a pre-Indo-European tradition rooted in the deep Neolithic heritage of the Aegean region, a tradition that may have been related to other pre-Greek languages of the Eastern Mediterranean, but that left no clear surviving descendants and no parallel text that could serve as a Rosetta Stone. The isotope and DNA analysis published in PLOS 1 in 2022, which examined human mobility on Crete during the Late Bronze Age specifically, added an important new dimension to the picture of Minoan and Mycenaean interaction. Most of the humans, sampled from Neolithic and Bronze Age sites across Crete, had sulfur and strontium isotope values consistent with being local to the island, showing no evidence for wide-scale movement of people from the Greek mainland or other distant areas during the core Minoan period. However, 4 individuals from the Late Bronze Age cemetery at Armenoi had isotope values not typically found in Crete, consistent with an origin elsewhere. The site at Armenoi also produced some of the only examples of the Mycenaean Linear B script found outside of palace contexts on Crete, a detail suggesting that the individuals with non-Cretan isotope signatures may have been among the first Mycenaean settlers or administrators on the island during the period when Mycenaean influence was expanding from the mainland. This finding aligns with the broader historical picture of the Mycenaeans absorbing or displacing Minoan culture during the 15th century BCE, a process that was partly demographic, with at least some people moving from mainland Greece to Crete, but that did not involve a wholesale population replacement of the kind that would have left a clear genetic signal across the whole island. Like and subscribe, because the genetic link between the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and modern Greeks is the finding that connects this ancient story to living people in a way that no previous analysis could demonstrate. Modern Greeks closely resemble the ancient Mycenaeans, with around 70 to 80% of their DNA shared with these Bronze Age ancestors. The Minoans, as the genetic ancestors of the Mycenaeans, are therefore part of the genetic heritage of contemporary Greek people as well. The ancient DNA evidence establishes a continuous genetic thread running from the Neolithic farmers who arrived on Crete approximately 9,000 years ago through the Minoan civilization that those farmers' descendants built over the following 4 millennia, through the Mycenaeans, who were closely related to the Minoans while also carrying the steppe ancestry the Minoans lacked, through the historical Greek populations of the classical period, and into the modern Greek people alive today. The builders of the Palace of Knossos and the creators of the frescoes of Thera are not vanished people with no living relatives. They are the ancestors, through a long chain of generations and genetic mixing, of people living in Greece today. The broader significance of the Minoan origin findings extends beyond the Aegean. The 2017 Nature study demonstrated that sophisticated, complex civilization, palace complexes, writing systems, maritime trade networks, elaborate art traditions, could emerge from within a local population without requiring an external injection of culturally superior migrants. The Minoans did not need to have come from Egypt or Anatolia or the Levant to have developed what they developed. They developed it from within. The Neolithic farmers who had been on Crete for 4,000 years before the first palace was built accumulated knowledge, population density, social complexity, and technological capacity through internal processes, and eventually produced a civilization that astonished the ancient world. Sir Arthur Evans, whose life's work was built on the assumption that this level of sophistication required an external source, was wrong in precisely the way that is most revealing about how scholars of his era, and many eras before and after, underestimated the capacity of local populations to generate extraordinary complexity without external intervention. The undeciphered Linear A script remains. The origin of the specific language the Minoans spoke remains unknown. The question of what exactly happened to Minoan civilization in the Late Bronze Age, whether a volcanic eruption, a Mycenaean conquest, a combination of both, or some other catastrophe, remains a subject of ongoing research. The Eastern Caucasian and Iranian component in Minoan ancestry is established, but not yet fully explained in terms of the specific migration route or cultural context that produced it. There is more work to be done, but the foundational question that Arthur Evans first posed at the turn of the 20th century, the question that animated a century of archaeological and genetic debate, has been answered. The Minoans came from Crete. They had been there, in one ancestral form or another, for thousands of years before the first great palace was built. The civilization that seemed to spring from nowhere in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean was not imported. It grew there, from roots that ancient DNA can now trace across 9,000 years of human presence on a single island, and from people whose descendants are still walking the soil of the Greek world today. The question of what ended the Minoan civilization is one that the genetic evidence has also begun to illuminate, even if it cannot fully resolve it. The traditional narrative proposed two main candidates: the eruption of Thera, the volcano on the island of Santorini approximately 70 miles north of Crete, and the Mycenean takeover from mainland Greece. The Theran eruption, which produced one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the Holocene epoch, generated tsunamis that swept the Cretan coastline, disrupted trade routes, and may have triggered years of agricultural failure through volcanic winter effects. The dating of this eruption has been contested for decades, with radiocarbon evidence and ice core data suggesting a date around 1620 BCE, while traditional archaeological stratigraphy placed it closer to 1500 BCE. The genetic evidence from isotope analysis at Armenoe and the broader population continuity demonstrated in the ancient DNA record suggests that the Minoan population on Crete was not eliminated by the Theran eruption or by the Mycenean expansion. The people remained. What changed was the cultural and political framework. The palace system was disrupted. The Mycenean administrative language, Linear B, replaced Linear A, and the distinctly Minoan cultural traditions that had defined the civilization gradually gave way to a Mycenean-dominated synthesis. That synthesis itself eventually collapsed in the Bronze Age catastrophe of approximately 1200 BCE, the Late Bronze Age collapse, which destroyed palace-based civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. Simultaneously, and it remains one of the most intensively studied and still only partially understood events in ancient history, the Mycenaean palace system fell. The Linear B scribal tradition disappeared. The trade networks that had connected Crete, mainland Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt broke down. What emerged from that collapse centuries later was the civilization we call Classical Greece, one that inherited from its Minoan and Mycenaean ancestors not just genetic material, but cultural fragments, mythological traditions, and technological knowledge that had survived the Dark Age between the Bronze Age collapse and the Archaic period in forms that scholars are still working to fully trace and understand. Like and subscribe, because the Minoan legacy in classical Greek civilization is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the ancient DNA story. The myths that classical Greeks told about Crete, the story of King Minos, the Labyrinth, the Minotaur, Daedalus, and Icarus, the tributes sent from Athens to Crete, all of these point toward a memory, however transformed by centuries of retelling of the Minoan civilization's power and cultural influence. The bull imagery central to Minoan art, the bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos, the bull's head rhytons used in ritual, the prominence of bull horns as architectural decorations on palace walls, filtered into Greek mythology as the Minotaur, and into the story of Zeus disguising himself as a bull to abduct Europa and bring her to Crete. The goddess traditions of Minoan religion, featuring female figures of evident spiritual authority, the Nipostils Dedas, the snake goddess figurines, the female presiding figures in Minoan ritual scenes, may have contributed to the development of specific female divine figures in the Greek pantheon. The Minoan contribution to what eventually became classical Greece was real, mediated through the Myceneans who absorbed Minoan culture during the late Bronze Age, and visible in both the genetic data and the cultural record, even though the mechanisms of transmission remain incompletely understood. What ancient DNA has provided is not just an answer to the origin question. Though it settled that conclusively, it has provided a framework for understanding the Minoans as part of a continuous human story reaching from the first Neolithic settlers on Crete 9,000 years ago, through the builders of the palaces, through the Mycenaeans who inherited their cultural legacy, and ultimately to the modern Mediterranean world. The Minoans were not visitors from a more advanced civilization who disappeared without trace. They were the ancestors, in both genetic and cultural terms, of people and traditions that shaped the entire trajectory of Western civilization. And they were there all along, on the island where their ruins still stand, in the soil where their bones were found, and in the DNA that finally told the story they left behind in a script that still cannot be read.